again, and welcome to Just Say No. I'm your host, Maria Calabrese, coming to you on KCAA Radio, 1050 AM, 106.5 FM radio. What we've seen take place in the cannabis industry over the past several years has been the most rapid transformation of any sector I've ever witnessed. If you consider the cannabis plant with 3 harvestable components, each serving unique purposes, there aren't too many other crops that can claim that versatility. And if you're wondering why this topic should matter to you, consumers and businesses alike, well, the impact of regulatory inaction might just surprise you. So let's get ready to uncover how cannabis advertising and marketing laws, or the lack thereof, shape what you know, shape public perception, and how brands can and cannot communicate about cannabis. Hey, whether you're a consumer looking for answers or a brand seeking clarity, this conversation matters because it affects all of us. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to demand transparency and fairness from both businesses and policymakers. So sit back and relax as we explore some of the most pressing themes shaping the cannabis industry with some of the brightest minds in the space.
By 2020, Bank of America and Merrill Lynch estimate that will grow to $35 billion. And many experts believe it could eventually reach $200 billion each and every year.
I'm thrilled to welcome today's guest, attorney Walter Chad Blackham from McMurray & Schuster. Chad is an expert in cannabis compliance and litigation, advising businesses on navigating the complex web of these inconsistent federal and state laws governing advertising, marketing, privacy, and consumer protection. He's played a key role in his firm's cannabis, CBD, and hemp practice, helping businesses across the industry, from startups to major enterprises, address challenges unique to the cannabis market. His clients span the entire cannabis vertical, including cultivators, processors, dispensaries, physicians, and patients. Chad's background includes regulatory compliance work at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, giving him a unique perspective on statutory compliance, privacy, and data security, key concerns for both businesses and consumers in today's cannabis landscape. Whether you're a cannabis entrepreneur seeking to stay compliant or a consumer trying to make informed choices, Chad's insights will be invaluable. So let's dive in. Welcome, Chad.
Maria, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction and what a tough act to follow, but thank you very much for having me on.
It's so great to see you again. Chad and I participated together in a National Cannabis Industry Association webinar, really digging down into the legalities that his firm has put together, a guide on unlocking cannabis compliance. So Chad, getting right into it, how exactly does the patchwork of marketing and advertising laws, with the absence of clear federal guidance, affect the information consumers receive about cannabis products?
Well, Maria, that word that you use, the patchwork of laws, that is so apropos and that is so perfect. Because what we run into with this situation is something really, really unique. And, the only kind of equivalent I can think of in any other area of the law is maybe Bitcoin or something else that's brand new like cannabis. But every single state has their own unique cannabis regime. Now, of course, there are crossovers, there's some blend, there's some feed over, some reciprocity. But what you're looking at here, as you aptly described, is a complete patchwork of laws. Now, when these regulators are making these laws, their primary focus is, of course, on the licensing, building out the facilities, some of the ensuing regulatory compliance. But where does that leave marketing and advertising? Well, it usually leaves them on the back burner. So, one thing that often happens is you'll have some of the other regulations and laws that have been built up for, gosh, nigh on 100 years at this point, subsumed in. You have all these rules, regulations, some that are by constructive notice, meaning they post something up on the website and you're expected to know that. But they're bringing in hundreds of years of regulatory compliance work into the cannabis sector by virtue of these UDAP laws and consumer protection laws that we're going to be talking about shortly. So there's some commonality. A lot of states have similar UDAP laws, but they all have their own jurisprudence. A court case in California does not have the same effective law as a court case in Ohio when you're looking at an Ohio law. And you mentioned as well there is the absence of clear federal guidance, and I love the way that you said that, because people will often say that the feds haven't said anything, they've given no guidance, and that simply isn't true. It's just what they've given is so confusing, it's almost worse than no guidance. So we do have a lack of clear guidance. We have some conflicting opinions from the DEA, the FTC, on items such as novel or minor cannabinoids like Delta 8, other cannabinoids such as CBN and CBG. So we do have an overlay with the FTC through the FTC Act, however, that also has these UDAP laws that we're going to be getting into. So there, again, is no clear set federal law governing the marketing and advertising of cannabis. So we have to look elsewhere to these laws that have been on the books for decades, really.
Wow. And UDAP is unfair, deceptive, abusive advertising practices. Yes?
Acts or practices, but you hit the unfair, abusive, and deceptive parts, and those are what the claims are. So you got it perfect.
And it's synonymous basically with consumer protection, would you say?
Yes. One of the things people think of when they hear of UDAP or unfair deceptive practices, they think, wow, this must be a really niche specific item that comes up in very limited circumstances. To the contrary, UDAP, when I say UDAP, I want you to think of consumer protection. The two are absolutely synonymous, as you said. When an attorney general brings a consumer protection claim, they're doing it through a UDAP statute. When the 50 state attorney generals went after big tobacco for some of their concerns around advertising towards children and marketing, it was through the UDAP statute. So absolutely, consumer protection actions, whether from a private citizen or a government regulatory body, will be brought through these UDAP statutes.
Okay. And then what are this patchwork of inconsistent laws? What type of legal challenges do they present for well-meaning brands as they try to navigate the confusing regulations?
It's really interesting because especially in the cannabis sector, we have in industry, we have so many brands out there who truly are, in my opinion, really trying to do the right thing by consumers. They want to provide medicine or adult use products in the dosages described accurately with a consistent product that people know what they're getting. Thankfully, there's good news when it comes to the patchwork of laws, insofar as there's a lot of commonality amongst them. So when we talk about UDAP, what is an unfair, deceptive, abusive act or practice? It's very subjective, right? It sounds like a catch-all term, and it is. But really, it's any type of thing that a reasonable consumer might be misled by. I'm thinking, of course, of things like misrepresentations as to price, the availability of a good, the quality or grade of a good. If I tell you I'm going to give you a certain grade of steel, but then sell you a different grade, you'll probably be upset. That's UDAP. Similarly, every single state despite the patchwork, has a anti-deceptive law on the books, meaning deceptive acts and practices are prohibited. The federal government has the same thing through the FTC Section 5 Act. So businesses can take some heart in knowing that there is commonality among the law and the books. But as I alluded to earlier, the tricky part and where you need legal advice really comes in with the differences between each state. The law on the books might be similar, but it doesn't mean it's been interpreted the same in each state. It doesn't mean it's being viewed the same. It doesn't even mean that the regulators are enforcing the same laws. In cannabis, some states are really big on pesticide enforcement and some aren't.
Wow. Wow. And then back to the consumer consequence and stake.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on both of them, the consumer and the brands, the inconsistencies and the lack of clarity from these federal regulatory agencies commissioned to protect consumers ends up leaving gaps in consumer education and protection, would you say?
I absolutely would. There's a fine balance between regulation and over-regulation, but we really aren't at that balance on either side of the coin right now in the cannabis industry. I teach a class over at Capital Law School on cannabis law and policy. And my students are always flabbergasted by the amount of problems that come up in the packaging and advertising space. We begin the packaging and advertising section. Their first impulse is, well, the packaging can't lie. How much more can there possibly be? And then we get to the 70 pages in the book and they're like, oh my gosh. But let me bring one issue up for you in particular. Just THC amount. Right? When we're simply measuring THC. Now, first off, THC content is not the end all be all of the effects that a particular cannabis product will have on a patient. So that in of itself is an issue that people think that is self-sufficient. But when we're looking at THC content, we have three ways of measuring that alone. Are we looking at total THC? Are we looking at only THC9, tetrahydrocannabinol 9? Are we looking at a THC per milligram analysis where it's saying, as is very common with gummies, 10 milligrams per gummy, which is really a THC per weight analysis. So even within such a small thing as how do we measure THC, there's multiple variations. Then you get into things like taxation, whether the other cannabinoids other than THC and CBD, minor cannabinoids, are also listed on there. And of course, you get into things such as flavonoids, terpenes, which a lot of bud tenders may not necessarily be educated on, able to inform the consumers, let alone the consumers themselves. So consumers, first and foremost, often are not aware of their rights when it comes to these UDAP laws. They very often provide
and
private.
not to interrupt, but you have just hit where I was going with this interview. What's in it for me? What's in it for the consumer? And so you are right on point. So that's what I want to really dig down into.
Absolutely. Well, what's in it for consumers is also what's in it for businesses in this type of space. And that's something you really do not see in a lot of industries. The reason for that, I think, is in a typical consumer business relationship, there's a somewhat adversarial relationship insofar as the business is trying to kind of really eke out a little bit more margin with the price that the consumer will find acceptable to a point where the consumer is not going to reject the good. Cannabis is a little bit different in that respect. Consumers are often willing to pay over face value for their good so long as it has proper consumer protections on it. It's labeled properly. It doesn't have improper pesticides. It's been tested appropriately and has a proper certificate of authority. So what's in it for consumers? Why do they want their businesses to be legal? Well, the most important part is what you're getting. I talk, as you mentioned, Maria, a lot of, or some of my clients are also patients as well as doctors. And one of the questions one of the issues I run into most often is consistency in the products, right? They'll have an edible one day and then they'll have it the next day, and the effect is not the exact same. This is a consumer protection issue relating to the testing, gradiency, and consistency of the product. So what's in it for consumers is a more reliable, trustworthy, and safe product. As we look to, medicinal adoption, we'll get into this later, I'm sure, with Schedule 3 at the end of this year and the beginning of next. Consumer protection is going to be the name of the game. We know how cannabis has been viewed. It was viewed back in the early 1900s as a potential health item. Then there was a shift towards criminal enforcement through the war on drugs up until very recently. If we want to keep this streak going, if we want businesses and the government and consumers to continue to view cannabis as medicine or an adult use product, it has to be consistent, it has to be reliable. I mean, gosh, can you imagine if you go down to the liquor store and you buy a pack of beer and oops, I'm sorry, this one has the same ABV as a bottle of vodka because we mixed it wrong.
That's what concerns me, the potential that the lack of clarity and consistency of the legal framework has for unsafe products, and how there are businesses exploiting the regulatory gaps to the detriment of the consumer safety and public health. We need cohesive standards, right? That will make the risk being flooded with unsafe or untested products will help minimize that and reward the well-meaning brands, I would imagine.
100%. And you see this actually with your and my work with the NCIA and the marketing and advertising guidelines, and why it's so important to put these across the industry. Very often, for instance, when you look at some of the rules and regulations for a processor, for instance, in many states, processors, for those who may not know, are often responsible for turning raw cannabis plant material into processed forms such as food, beverages, concentrates, edibles, things of that nature. Processors are, in very many situations, are subject to FDA regulations. They're interacting with what is essentially food. They're cooking in many of their operations, and even anyone who's watched Bar Rescue or thought about opening a restaurant can tell you there's a lot of rules and regulations around keeping that clean. So what a lot of states do is they slip right into the regulations a single line that says you have to follow the industry standards for this particular industry, abide by this particular trade group's requirements. And these are, it's a small single line in the rules and regulations, but that's a really big undertaking for a lot of these businesses. Some states require them to act with the type of propriety that a controlled substance lab would, a vestige of the fact that cannabis is still Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. So it's really important that we start trying to find a way to unify this to create a more cohesiveness in the industry, so businesses aren't battling their own rules and regulations and can follow.
Yeah, and the challenges that these brands are facing that want to operate responsibly in the legally gray space, there's products that are literally dying on the vine. I hate when I have to disappoint a customer or a member of our Green Bee Life Hive that falls in love with, so many of these CBD products behind me are no longer available. I have to disappoint them and try to explain to them that the brands are they can't carry as many SKUs, or they just, despite having a great legal counsel like your firm offers, the exposure, the risk is too high. You have many CBD brands that were very hopeful that the big box stores would carry them, and you did see CBD products in the bigger box stores, but then because of this legally gray space, the big box stores started to pull, and the manufacturers these brands are dying on the vine. And you mentioned the FDA and their inaction, right, on evaluating CBD as an ingredient in food or supplements is a big part of it. And it seems like there's a regulatory game of ping pong. So the FDA throws it back to Congress. Congress throws it back to the FDA. Then you have the DEA, the FTC. So
it is an absolute mess. So the biggest change in cannabis policy in probably the last 70 years or so since the Controlled Substances Act was implemented was the 2018 Farm Bill. And what the 2018 Farm Bill did was it further legalized, after the 2014 Farm Bill, it further legalized hemp and hemp derived CBD products. So hemp under the bill is defined as 0.3% or less tetrahydrocannabinol 9 THC 9, so 0.3% or less. The fact that they defined it only with regards to THC 9 is actually part of the problem. So we're getting a huge proliferation of all these CBD products, and many of them are legal, right? They've got the 0.3% or less THC 9. But what we've really started to see is this whole new market that was not anticipated by the 2018 Farm Bill, not anticipated by cannabis producers, but was anticipated by the gray market. And we're calling this the hemp derived cannabinoid or minor cannabinoid market. So these are products that contain 0.3% or less THC9, meet the federal definition of hemp, are processed into CBD, so are federally legal CBD, but then contain extremely large amounts of other cannabinoids ranging from, delta 8 to THCV, THCA, CBN, CBG. There's hundreds of cannabinoids, the list goes on forever. So we're running into this very unusual situation where we have some products that are following the letter of the law, but almost certainly not the spirit. And this puts consumers and cannabis producers in a really tough space. Technically, these individuals are working with hemp, which is not cannabis, technically. So they can take all the tax breaks and all the deductions and credits that these cannabis businesses simply are not able to. And, what do they get for following the rules and regulations? They have a 60% effective tax rate. They aren't able to work hand in glove with regulatory advisors the same way as other businesses. And it's really a shame. So the CBD market is in a really, really tough spot right now. For that reason, we have this whole hemp-derived cannabinoid issue as producers and consumer. And really the consumers, I think, are the ones who lose out here. In many states in particular that do not have medical or recreational or adult use cannabis, consumers are looking for a way to consume cannabis legally. And so many of them will turn to CBD. And what often happens is you'll have consumers and they'll drive by stores and they'll say, we have THC here or Delta 8 or buy cannabis here. Yep. And what the consumers do not know is that these are hemp derived cannabinoid products. This isn't to say that all hemp derived cannabinoid products are bad. We could stand to get a little more information on some of this is the synthetic ones, I think. But we know things like CBN, CBG, these are totally fine. But the problem arises when these hemp-derived cannabinoid products are separated out from the typical cannabis regulatory regimes. The result is they aren't subject to the same testing, same pesticide restrictions, same quality control. So you're really relying on the word of the manufacturer and producer rather than any type of consumer compliance efforts to verify what's going on.
All right. Well, hang on. You're at a perfect point because we're 20 minutes into the show, and where I am in California, it is 4:20. And you have just dropped you've just dropped 20 minutes of knowledge bombs on us. And every 4:20 we take a moment to ask our guests for a quick hit. Quick hit, 4:20. What do you got for us?
I've got a few, but in terms of a knowledge one, I've got a really good one that I think you might like. So CBD is legal, but as long as it contains the 0.3% or less THC9. But what a lot of people is, as well as manufactured forms, what a lot of people may not know though is that these CBD foods and beverages that you find in gas stations and retail stores, those continue to be federally illegal, even if it's CBD, even if it's 0.3%, even if it has no other cannabinoids in it whatsoever. And the reason for that is under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with the FDA, a product can only be included in food or drink if it's generally recognized as safe, and I'm not making this up for the segment, or if it's grass, right? So unless the product is grass, exactly, unless it's grass, it has to go through a really, really lengthy review process before you put in food or drink. As you can imagine, CBD has been illegal for the past near 100 years. Don't have a whole lot of studies showing it's super safe, even though colloquially we know it is. And as a result, CBD is not grass, according to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and technically cannot be included in foods or beverages.
That was a knowledge bomb. It was a potent, important, quick hit. And I'm going to use it because every time I run into somebody who tells me, yeah, but CBDs, why should, I try to get people to care and understand. And people will say, yeah, but CBD is legal. I'm like, I kind of know it's not. Not if you put it in a gummy or a drink mix. Oh, yes, I saw it at Walmart or the gas station, like you said. Well, I'm just going to play your quick hit. I'm just going to send them a link. So how do we bridge the gap? How do we bridge the gap to get to a path of clarity? What needs to change?
So the first thing that needs to change, thankfully, it looks like it's going to be happening quite soon, and that's the rescheduling of cannabis. Now, so currently, cannabis, specifically again tetrahydrocannabinol 9 (THC 9), is a Schedule 1 substance under the Controlled Substances Act. That is the source of cannabis's illegality, the reason there's a complete federal prohibition.
And
And
not to interrupt, can you just explain to people, because not everybody knows what that means to be public enemy number one? What does
right.
that mean? What is Schedule 1?
Public enemy number one is right. So the Controlled Substances Act places drugs on a schedule of 1 to 5, 1 being the most dangerous with the least medical benefit, and 5 being the least dangerous with the most potent medical benefit. Cannabis THC 9 is currently a Schedule 1 drug, meaning it has no currently accepted medical benefit and a high potential for mental and physical addiction. Um, the funny thing, as you may know, is the FDA approved a CBD based, multiple CBD based anti seizure epilepsy drugs for children, of specifically Epidiolex, a little bit ago, which seems to fly in the face of that, as well as the GRAS designation of CBD. But really, it's quite ironic in that respect, that they're saying in one hand, it has all of this danger, but at the same time there's certain government patents on seeds and other production methods. So it really is quite an unusual dichotomy. But the first thing that really needs to happen is the change of Schedule 1, which looks like it's going to be happening. So there's a petition to move it to Schedule 3, recommended by HHS, Health and Human Services, kicked over to the Department of Justice. And this is a fun little quick hit for any attorneys out there. But the rescheduling process for cannabis is entirely unique, wholly unique. It does not bear any other resemblance to any other type of rule change or regulation change. Very unusual. And there's been some uncertainty with the new administration coming in whether the Schedule 3 change is going to continue to happen. Thankfully, it looks like it will. But Schedule 3 is going to kick cannabis into the third level of the Controlled Substances Act, meaning it has some currently accepted medical benefit and a low to mild potential for psychological or physical abuse. So we're not quite there yet, but it's a lot better. And what's really important about the Schedule 3 designation is for medical cannabis businesses, and you touched on it so beautifully, Maria, that this is a health and adult recreational use issue, but a lot of the gateway and a lot of the way we get our foot in the door is through the medicinal aspect. And I don't want to speak for you, but I think we probably share similar views insofar as that one's the primary uses of the plant is for medical benefit. But one of the great things about Schedule 3 is these medical businesses are going to be able to use FDIC insured banks. Right now, cannabis businesses cannot use federally insured banks. They are, this sounds like a joke, but they're literally stuffing money into safes and then carrying tens of thousands of dollars in their car to their mattress. The Schedule 3 designation is also going to open up a few more advertising and marketing restrictions for them. And it's also going to enable medical cannabis companies to potentially take credits and deductions. Currently, Section 280E of the tax code, which I'm sure many of your viewers have heard the name, and if we have time, I have a fantastic story about how 280E came about. But currently, 280E prevents cannabis businesses or any business dealing in a Schedule 1 or 2 drug from taking credits or deductions. The effective tax rate for cannabis businesses because of this is like 60% in some cases. They're paying 60% of their revenue in taxes. extremely high. Once we get to Schedule 3, this won't be an issue. So they'll have banking access. They'll be able to raise capital. They'll be able to utilize the U.S. tax code in the way literally every other type of business can. I think one of the questions we need to ask isn't just how do we harmonize the federal laws to make things better for them, but how they manage to survive so long the way things are.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on the road from normalization to legalization, I mean, anyone out there who has this entrepreneurial spirit or is coming at it from a well-meaning place, look at what you're saddled with. If you think this is a green rush, think again. Guys, this right? This is
Absolutely.
we need to turn it into a green revolution, because how could anyone enter into this business unless, nothing against them, but if you're a giant MSO, I mean, you have to lawyer up. You'll get wiped out in fines and violations. And then with 280E, if you can't write off your business expenses on top of having the burden of legal expenses that unlike in any other industry, and then you can't even write those costs off. I mean, the consequence back to the consumer is we want well-meaning brands to enter the space. And another episode I'd love to have you come back for is the impact of social equity. I mean, how does anybody with a social equity right? How do they even, what? Our phones are ringing off the hook. Chad, everyone wants to chat with you. There's so many questions. So let's hear the 280E tax story. You've got dispensary owners in LA burning to hear this story.
Really briefly, that the social equity idea sounds amazing, and I would love to talk with you on that in the future, because a little bit of a teaser. Our firm was actually involved in the most prominent social equity litigation and lawsuit in Ohio for our cannabis system. So,
what was that? What was the lawsuit?
It was the PharmaCann lawsuit, two ends at the end of PharmaCann, but involved a bunch of companies. We were representing Harvest Grows in that case. I'm sure it'll pop up if you check it, right? But the 280E story, oh gosh, I was really hoping we'd get to it. So that's fantastic.
You got people curious, including me.
Perfect. So Section 280E, as I mentioned, prevents businesses dealing with Schedule 1 and 2 drugs from taking ordinary or necessary business credits and deductions, all credits and deductions, really. But the law came about, I believe, in the 80s. There was a young man who got pulled over driving by a cop, and the cop searched his car, and he found fairly large amounts of cocaine. He found baggies, a scale, zip ties, and he said, okay, well, you're clearly trafficking cocaine, and he arrested the man for cocaine trafficking. At the man's trial, he tried to argue that as a cocaine trafficker, his profession was cocaine trafficking, and therefore he should be able to deduct the costs of his scales, his baggies, his zip tie, and the court agreed with him because nothing in the tax code prohibited the deduction of an illegal business. So 280E was implemented after that man took I know it sounds too funny to be true, but it absolutely is. So 280E was implemented by Congress after a cocaine dealer successfully deducted his scales, baggies, and ties from his taxable basis.
Okay, well, you're reading my mind, because our next segment is legal updates. And one of the things I love to do is ask our attorney guest for the craziest laws and then the most sensible ones. And my crazy law segment I call, I'm not making this up. So now you're telling me with certainty on my next episode, if I want to throw to a crazy law and I'm not making this up, I can actually say that 280E originated from a cocaine dealer claiming and prevailing on the assertion that he could write off his Ziploc bags and zip ties and all of his business expenses for running his illegal cocaine operation. That was at one time okay.
That is completely correct. It is hilarious and comical as it sounds, but, as the saying goes, "Bad cases make good law."
Unbelievable. It's time for Nip It in the Bud. So, what's one of your most common misconceptions you run into, or something that you would just like to nip in the bud?
Well, I got a little bit of a fun one first, but and of course, I'm not a doctor. None of this is medical advice. This is all based of things I've read in my own opinion, edification. But one of the most common myths about cannabis is that it negatively impacts your memory, and particularly your short and long term memory, short term more so. But that can have really deleterious and negative effects over the long term. There have been fewer studies on this than many other things. Um, a recent study, actually two studies. The first was a long-term longitudinal study out of Sweden and the Netherlands area, which found that cannabis, long-term cannabis, and this, I believe, this was the first and potentially the only current long-term longitudinal cannabis-based study looking at individuals over around 20-year period. It found no correlation between cannabis use and negative memory, short or long term, for long term users using 10 plus years or more, at least, to join your day, which is how many of these studies classify heavy users as well. um, so that's really a big significant part. The other one is that there's a recent study, and a lot of people might get a kick out of this, that cannabis use actually may help prevent Alzheimer's, and that specifically high CBD forms of cannabis can act as a neuroprotectant for your synapses and help the signals in your brain fire and get sent faster. Cannabis has also been shown to potentially create new neural pathways in your brain. What's really interesting about that is when we associate new neural pathways in the brain with drug use, cannabis is a drug, we often associate it in a negative way. It might be forming an addiction pathway in the case of opiates, for instance. What we see with cannabis, interestingly, is some of these pathways are remarkably similar to your brain's normal pathways, just in different sections, not creating the same addictive tendencies, but potentially providing the same protective benefits.
Schedule one, my beep.
Exactly. Exactly.
Jeez. I was familiar with the second study we had in episode 3. We had Dr. Manesh Gurn, a neuroscientist from
Amazing.
UC San Francisco. And he's in Robin Carhart Harris's world-renowned lab studying the effects of psilocybin and cannabis on the brain. And he had talked to us about that second study you mentioned. And when you talk about a neuroprotectant, one other thing to help substantiate your nipping this myth in the bud, and who better than to ask a lawyer? The U.S. government had the patent on cannabinoids as a neuroprotectant until very recently. Is that correct?
It absolutely is. Yes.
How did the well, that's another episode. We'll have an episode on Harry Anslinger, the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act.
Oh, yes.
We'll follow it through the 1970s, the 80s war on drugs. That's a whole other episode, but I think it is so critical and important for people to understand the consequences of this being on a Schedule 1, and then how those consequences parlay into the advertising and marketing compliance, and how that impacts brands, well-meaning brands, guys, which impact you looking for top shelf premium products that literally are up in smoke.
The comment there too, the reference to Anslinger was, you highlight a really fantastic part of what the war on drugs really did. So cycling back a little bit, we talked about the GRAS designation, generally recognized as safe. How do you determine if something is generally recognized as safe, right? Well, the federal standard, and this is a federal law under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is in order to determine something is GRAS, you need what is referred to as reliable and competent scientific evidence. Now, how on earth do you get reliable and competent scientific evidence on a Schedule 1 drug that nobody is allowed to study? It's kind of a catch-22 rock and a hard place thing, right? So Anslinger and the Controlled Substances Act and the war on drugs, all this put us in a cart before the horse situation where we're saying it's not generally recognized as safe, but we're not going to allow you to study its effects to make any further determinations on your own behalf.
It's in a box. It's in a box. And who better than attorneys to make a case for it? I mean, it's improperly imprisoned. So we got to bust it out. We got to bust it out, people. But it's the people who have the power. So moving into consumer insights and tips, speaking about people having the power, I mean, what are the best ways for consumers to find a trustworthy brand in between all of this, navigating this evolving market with all these twists and turns and nuances?
Well, the first thing a consumer can do is do their own research. The larger companies are generally fairly reputable. If they've been around for a while in the space, they must be doing something right. But what you can also do is you can actually look at your local regulatory authority. For instance, in Ohio, this would be the Department of Commerce, and they'll list all the enforcement actions and the letters and the warnings and the concerns that they send to these companies. Sign up for local mailing lists for trade industry groups. Maybe your local cannabis group. In Ohio, that might be OCAN, California NORML, for instance. They send out plenty of amazing newsletters and updates. And these consumer groups, their primary focus is also consumer protection. So getting involved, getting knowledgeable about the products is the first step. Also learn what works best for you. We talked about this a little bit at the outset. There is such a prevalent view in marketing and advertising cannabis that THC content is king, that consumers are always chasing the biggest THC high, that they want massive 90% concentrates or 30. I saw a flower being advertised as 38% THC content when I was in Vegas this past weekend. And I have to tell you, first off, I don't believe it. Second off, who wants that?
Exactly. Yes.
Right. So when it comes to making
certainly not the majority of consumers.
Certainly not the majority. And there's certainly a market for these specialty niche products. But if you have an average consumer who's got, they're coming to a bud tender and they say, I have trouble sleeping, or I have glaucoma, it makes my vision bad. What do I do? And they're not knowledgeable about the effects of terpenes and other cannabinoids. CBN, cannabinol, is great for sleep. THC9, not so much. CBG, a little iffy. So if the bud tender is, you have severe pain, I'm going to give you the strongest product we have, that may not be best for that particular individual. Maybe they need some terpene. Beta caryophyllene is a terpene that is fantastic for pain management. Maybe they need that more than they need a high THC content.
What would you find that in? What would you find that in?
So it depends on the product and how it's manufactured. Terpenes can be inserted and taken out as needed, but you raise a really interesting point that many states do not even list what terpenes are on there.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a whole separate issue outside of even the THC content. And then again, most states are only listing THC, THCA, and CBD. You're not getting any knowledge about any of the other cannabinoids, let alone all these other phytochemicals inside of the plant. And then, of course, you run into things such as the entourage effect, where many people believe that when all of the cannabinoids are included together, they have a more cohesive kind of group effect than if you single them out as an isolate. So the first thing consumers really need to do is find what works best for them. And the way to do that is to find a knowledgeable bud tender with a dispensary you like. And if possible, aim for products that provide the most possible amount of information on THC content, terpenes, and also growing and production methods such as pesticide usage.
Very important. And I mean, this is assuming you're in a state where it's legal.
Mm-hmm.
So-called legal, right?
Absolutely.
Wow, Chad. I mean, and that is for products with more than 0.3% THC, that would be if you're in a state where it's legal, you
Yes.
would get that from a dispensary. But the point you're making is all this measurements and benchmarks is based on THC. But when you're going to a dispensary, it's not that you're just going to get something that's got greater CBD than 0.3%. It's because it's not like you said, you're not looking for something with 38% THC. It's so much more than the promise of chasing a high. It's the intention behind it. And you mentioned some people would like to have it as an option for sleep as opposed to pharmaceutical drugs that don't work for them or have too many side effects. So it's the intention behind it, and it's not the THC that's going to be the be all and end all. It's the phytocannabinoids, it's the terpene profile, but it's nuanced. It's nuanced. The science is nuanced. The applications are nuanced. The law is nuanced. And I just love speaking with experts like yourself. And guys, I have to say, as a business owner and someone trying to make my way in this space, as a publishing company, having to be very, very concerned about what type of advertising and marketing materials brands want me to put forward, you need firms like McMurray and Schuster. I can't say enough about McMurray and Schuster because just for the other businesses out there, I'm sure they've all gone through what I've gone through. I just wanted to give my hats off to McMurray and Schuster, Chad. Whenever I'm looking for legal counsel, that's just one other suggestion for businesses. There you go. Consumer insight and tip. What should businesses look for when you're looking to hire a law firm? What drew me to your law firm and having you here as a guest today is you guys have a prolific, your founders, if you could speak a little bit about them, past history in unregulated spaces. And there are so many, not bad mouthing anybody, and you're teaching. This is so exciting at a university. Law to the next generation of our legal experts in this evolving marketplace. But what should businesses look for when looking for a law firm? My pain point was it was disparate. I would talk to one law firm and say, can I get a trademark on this? They'd say yes. Another law firm, they'd say no. Another law firm that would say, well, I need a $10,000 retainer. And it seemed like they wanted tens of thousands of dollars from me to write a white paper on it to educate them. So I can't say enough about you guys. And I think it's because you're sitting on the shoulders of two incredible women, female-founded law firm. Tell us a little bit about the founding partners and about the history. And for the businesses out there, what do you look for when you're vetting a law firm? Because this is the wild, wild west.
It really is. So we're me in particular. I'm absolutely blessed to work where I do at McMurray and Schuster. Our founding partners are Helen McMurray and Michelle Schuster. But as you know, it's a woman-owned law firm. They are both absolutely incredible. Really just inspiring women. They both came. All of our partners have, but they in particular came from separate big law firms. They both had histories in consumer protection offices as consumer protection chiefs in the Ohio Department of Commerce. So really storied, decorated public service record, great service in the private sector for extremely large, powerful law firms. And they both kind of were sitting around looking at each other one day and they said that, there's got to be a better way. There has to be a better work-life balance. There's a point at which, you can't really produce more beyond what you're doing. How do we do this? How do we create a firm that's oriented towards the future and the next generation of talent? And also specifically, what areas of law do we look at? So they created McMurray and Schuster. I cannot say enough positive things about the firm, and that's not just because they pay me. But it is. I've worked in a lot of places. It is the best place I've ever worked. And what really makes it unique is everyone here has come with experience from highly regulated niche areas, whether it's be consumer
Exactly.
protection. Yeah, absolutely. Consumer protection, telemarketing. I defend telemarketers, but I never like to tell anybody that because they assume I'm a bad guy. But just like our cannabis clients, the telemarketers are the compliant ones. So we bring experience from these really highly regulated niche areas with very few or very complex laws. We do a lot of privacy work as well that the regulators look at very intensely. They brought me on in around 2017, 2018, and asked me what I saw as a great area for the firm. I told them cannabis, and they were gracious enough to give me the opportunity to start the practice group and expand it. So, what do businesses need to look for? Well, they need to look for that, I think. And I'm not just saying that
I
because that's
agree.
what we
I
have.
agree. I
Yes.
learned the hard way. I learned the hard way, but I agree.
Well, you learn the hard way, but you learned the right way at the same time because too many people go down the track with the wrong firm and then they're 2 years into it and they realize it. But the thing with the cannabis sector you really need to look for is you need someone who has been in the system from the beginning. Who knows the law intimately. You don't want someone who's an employment lawyer who knows a little cannabis, a privacy lawyer who knows a little bit of cannabis. You want a cannabis lawyer, first and foremost, who knows employment, who knows privacy. We're lucky because we defend a lot of class actions, billion-dollar lawsuits, despite our small size, which is really kind of unique. So we've had experience in all these other areas as well. So it's not just the cannabis related stuff, but when you're looking for someone with cannabis issues, and we talked about this at the outset, there's no overarching federal law. There's a patchwork of law. There's no single one that applies. That doesn't mean there aren't federal laws that apply. They still are.
And
It's
you're still
wild.
on the hook for them. You're still on the hook for them. You mentioned something earlier about constructive notice. I mean, whether you know they exist or not, notice is out there, so you're on the hook.
I mean, and gosh, Maria, that's such a good point. Speaking of knowing if it's out there or not, I'm not sure if we're going to get to it later. This large lawsuit you and I had chatted out about a bit before, but there is a $2 billion lawsuit, ultimately reduced to a paltry 955 million on appeal. But there's a $2 billion lawsuit against a health and CBD supplement marketer. And the law that the people sued under relates to telemarketing, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. I guarantee you 90% of cannabis companies have not even heard of that law, yet there's a $2 billion lawsuit out there against the company for it. And it applies to any company making calls or texts to their clients, which cannabis companies certainly are. So, what you need to look for someone who knows the cannabis issues first and foremost, but you also got to find someone who knows those blind spots.
And those ancillary issues that
Mhm.
relate. So, Chad, I could talk to you forever. I hope you'll come back. This has been amazing. I'm a fan of McMurray and Schuster. I will disclose that. I'm not a client. I'm a
Well,
fan.
we're a fan of
So,
you and Green Bee Life as well, but that's no secret.
uh, so before we close today, I just want to thank you, Chad, for sharing your expertise, your insights into these legal challenges that do surround cannabis marketing, advertising, and affect consumer protection. You know, your work, the work at McMurray and Schuster, it's critical as we strive for a more equitable and
Yes.
informed, right? Cannabis industry. As we've explored, the lack of clear regulation has consequences. It has high stakes.
Mm.
For consumers, it creates confusion, misinformation, potential health risks from unsafe products coming off of 8 decades of an education vacuum, worse than an education vacuum, misinformation, you
Yes.
know, and yeah, and for consumers, it becomes harder to trust the products they buy. And unless they're excited about them and really getting the positive effects, they're not going to create the conversation for their policymakers to know that not only do we need to reschedule it, we need to deschedule it at the end of the day. Um, and, you know, these legal gray areas can very unintentionally put consumers and businesses at risk, especially when you mentioned not one state has a uniform system. Every state has different laws, and then you have federal laws, and then you have federal regulatory agencies that are in conflict with one another, or the legality is ambiguous. It's vague. It's ambiguous. Congress says from the hemp farm bill, yeah, hemp is legal if it's got 0.3%. But then the FDA has something to say about it. The DEA has something to say about it. The FTC has something to say about it. So, right? So for brands, the stakes are very high. And we need to support brands that are struggling to find their way, to be pioneers through this maze, to preserve premium top shelf brands. The risk of legal penalties to these businesses that are trying to do it right, the challenges they're faced with communicating responsibly, with unclear boundaries, the overall market instability, it makes it difficult for even the most ethical companies to operate confidently. And the instability, it stifles innovation. It increases cost. And that impacts all of us, because whether you're for cannabis or not, it's not just the promise of chasing a high, which again, there's a time and place, but people depend on it. There are pediatric cases where it's the only thing that helps with seizures, and fortunately it's now an ingredient in an anti-seizure drug, Epidiolex, but it's a game changer for many people where pharmaceutical drugs just don't have a solution, or the side effects are too negative. And, it's also a great alternative to alcohol. That's a whole other episode. But we need a cohesive regulatory framework that benefits all of us. And it's important, because that's what will foster trust, safety, and growth, both in the marketplace and in our communities. Which is a whole other topic, because in California, for every one legal dispensary, there's 4 illegal ones, and that's a whole other thing. But until that framework exists, education is our most powerful tool. So I'm like your biggest fan, because you're teaching and you found a platform, a university that's got it on their curriculum. So you go, Chad. And as consumers, what can we do? Well, we got to stay informed. We've got to ask questions. We've got to do our research, like Chad said, and we've got to hold both brands and policymakers accountable. For brands, focus on transparency as much as you can, and compliance, and get the right advice for compliance. You don't know it all. Trust me. I don't even want to know what potential violations are out there that as business owners we don't know about, but I'm sure Chad can tell us, and has already today, a good amount of them. So we're all part of this evolving landscape, and together we have the power to shape it. And we want to shape it responsibly. Your feedback is invaluable, so please reach out with any questions or comments about today's episode, and reach out with any other topics you'd like to hear in the future. You can connect with us on social media or through our website. Thank you for joining me today on Just Say No. Remember, knowledge is power, and together we are redefining cannabis one conversation at a time. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and for God's sakes, just say no. That's no with a K. K-N-O-W. They were 2 consonants off when they were saying just say no. So that's it. Thanks a lot. Just Say No is a Green Bee Life presentation, airing live weekly on Friday afternoons from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific on KCAA Radio and KCAA TV. Archived audio episodes are on Green Bee Life, greenbeelife.com, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and most third-party major platforms. For archived videos, check them out on GBL TV, on Green Bee Life, YouTube, and Rumble. To follow us, Our Instagram and Facebook is at Just Say No Radio. To apply to be a guest on the show or for sponsorship and advertising opportunities, go to greenbeelife.com/Just Say No, and feel free to reach out to me, Maria, for any questions. I'm at maria@greenbeelife.com, or call me at 818-758-6925.